Well, good evening, everybody. We'd like to welcome you to the March 16th version of the Farm Office Live. We'd like to welcome you on a beautiful day across the state of Ohio. I'd like to introduce your teaching team this evening for us. First, Diane Shoemaker, OSU Extension Field Specialist, Dairy Production Economics Specialist, and I think maybe a budding race car driver for getting back for all the way from Western Ohio to get home to join us for this evening. We have Barry Ward, Director of the OSU Income Tax School and Leader for Production Business Management. Barry, I don't think you sped today, but not like Diane did. So welcome to have you back. Peggy Hall has taken a well-deserved vacation this week, so she won't be on this evening's program. So we hope that Peggy is spending some time with that beautiful grandson of hers. I'm David Marison, the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Educator in Coshocton County. And we just keep adding to our screen. And we're so pleased that Dr. Sing-Ki Lee has joined us again tonight, OSU Assistant Professor. Sing-Ki is going to come on board and talk about some grain marketing issues. We have Robert Moore, our attorney, official attorney in our OSU Agriculture and Resource Law program. And spinning behind the scenes, making sure that everything works behind the scenes, is Jeff Lewis, attorney and program coordinator for the Ohio State University. So we'd like to welcome you to this evening's program. As always, I'd just like to give a few housekeeping tips as we begin. First, the slides and a recording of tonight's presentations will be found at go.osu.edu/Farm Office Live. In fact, those slides are already up there. You can access those. If you missed something tonight, you want to go back and hit the recording, you're more than welcome to do that. If anything changes before we get to our webinar on Friday, we'll post those slides as well. So you can, as always, go up there. And if we mention a previous webinar, you can also see the former recordings of all these Farm Office Lives all the way back to March of 2020 when we started the coronavirus pandemic. As always, feel free to ask questions. That's the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen on your toolbar. We'll be monitoring the Q&A feature so you can ask your questions in there. And as always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in there. Now, we will be using the chat feature. As you can see, Jeff is already dropping links, hot links into that chat feature. So if you want to get that direct link right to the slides, he already has that sitting there in the chat box for you. And if we end tonight's program and you think of a question that you would like to ask, don't hesitate to email it to any one of us. If you just remember one email, drop it to mine at marison.2@osu.edu. Be happy to forward it to the team member of choice that can answer that question. And as always, we'll be doing evaluation as you exit tonight's program. We keep this evaluation pretty quick and easy. Take you a couple minutes to do that. But again, we want to see what you thought about this evening's program, as well as what you would like to see in future Farm Office Live webinars. So that link should come up automatically. And I'll also post it at the end tonight in the chat box as well. So here, let's look at what are we going to talk about tonight. First, we'll do a real quick federal program update and legislative update. That's going to be a short update, especially if I lose my voice. And then we're going to look at fertilizer, hottest topic that's out there now. Fertilizer update and crop budgets. I know Barry keeps tweaking those budgets because we keep this upward movement in those fertilizer and fuel prices. The grain markets are crazy. So this is why we are so excited that Sing-Ki is joining us tonight to give us a quick look at the grain market outlook. And then something that was a request to look at some long-term care issues. We've been promoting our farm succession and estate planning workshops, and Robert's going to talk about Medicaid planning for long-term care costs. And then Diane has some numbers to show us on the financial efficiency of our grain operations that go through the FinPAC analysis with us at OSU Extension. So she's going to share with that. And at the end, we'd like to just give a spotlight on one of our favorite partners, and that's the Farm Service Agency. So with that, I'm going to go to the federal legislation and program update. And Robert, I think the first slide is yours.
Yes, it is. And I'm having some technical difficulties on my end, so you're just going to hear me for a little bit. So update on federal legislation. So some good news, government funding was signed yesterday by President Biden. So we do not have to worry about a government shutdown till at least October 1st. So that was good news, and it ended up being about 1.5 trillion. Federal debt limit, infrastructure, those were all signed last year. So the only pending legislation, or at least that we're going to talk about tonight, is Build Back Better. On the last program, I said it was Build Back Never. I'll still stick to that. I don't think it's coming back, although I think we may be able to call it Build Back a little bit better. There is a group of House Democrats that are proposing to carve out climate change provisions from Build Back Better. Senator Manchin has indicated that he might be willing to do something along those lines if he can get deficit reduction. It looks like deficit reduction means increasing taxes, and that looks like increasing the corporate tax rate and increasing the capital gains tax rate. So we'll see how that all works out. There's some informal discussions going on. Doesn't sound real formal at this point, but they are discussing. I think it is a possibility it might happen, but we'll see how things play out. That's all I've got.
All right, so that is a real quick federal legislative update. And I know a lot in Washington are focusing on what's happening overseas in the Ukraine. Just want to tag on to, and this will tie into what Robert was talking about, climate change, but I wanted to first remind that there's a couple deadline reminders. We know the biggest deadline was yesterday, and that was the RPLC sign up across the state of Ohio. And I know our Farm Service Agency offices have been working hard to make sure producers are getting their elections done. But there's also two other signups that are still in the forefront. For our dairy producers, the Dairy Margin Coverage and Supplemental Dairy Margin Coverage Program sign up. Of course, as we mentioned last month, that sign up was extended to March 25th. So about 9 days left in that sign up period for that program. And as we mentioned also last time, the Spot Market Hog Pandemic Program, the SMHPP sign up was extended. Originally was supposed to be done in February, but you can see they moved it to April 15th. So if you are a dairy producer, if you're a hog producer, and you haven't checked into those programs, would encourage you to check into the Farm Service Agency to learn more. Or of course, you can get onto some of our former broadcasts to get more information. And then climate smart agriculture and forestry. And one thing you'll notice, the lot more verbiage when it comes to climate smart, and climate smart is in the news. And one thing just maybe a subtle change, but how the USDA is promoting some of their programs, but putting an emphasis on soil health, carbon sequestration, reducing gas emissions, and to help mitigate the things that we can do at the farm level on climate change. So that includes some of the popular programs that we already know have been in existence, but they fall under this climate smart agriculture and forestry program, such things like the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, the EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and the Regional Conservation Partnership Program that we mentioned last month. And that ties into something that maybe this is not something that farmers are tying into, but agencies should be aware that there is a partnership for climate smart commodities funding opportunity that was announced on February 7th. There's $1 billion out there to develop partnerships to sponsor climate smart pilot projects across the nation. So those are looking at doing some practices that help reduce those carbon emissions, greenhouse emissions, sequester carbon, many things that we've been talking here at OSU Extension. And I know our university is going to be putting in a bid for one of these partnerships. If you want to learn more information about it, to see if you're a producer and want to see a little bit more about the climate smart funding opportunity, there's two funding pools that are going to be open May 6th, those are for proposals that are going to be anywhere between $5 million and $100 million. And then there's a second round of funding that is specifically targeting socially disadvantaged proposals. And that is on June 10th, that deadline. And you can see those, the amount on those is anywhere from $250,000 just up to $5 million. So something that some of our partner agencies we know here in Ohio are working together with Ohio State to put in a proposal here that could help us as producers here in the state of Ohio. And with that, Barry, I'm going to turn it to you, and I'll be navigating behind the scenes here for Barry because Barry is screen limited tonight. So you might hear Barry say, David, wake up and advance that slide. So here we go.
Thank you, David. I appreciate you helping me through. This is not ideal setup for me, but we'll make it. And it's good to have you all with us this evening. And we're always happy to have you with us. If we have some questions that we can answer, hopefully you'll throw that, as David mentioned earlier, in the Q&A feature, if it's something related to the topic. So I'm going to talk about the fertilizer issue, and then we're going to talk broadly about some of the things that are driving fertilizer prices. But we're going to start with talking about crop enterprise budgets, and we're going to start just generally what we're plugging in terms of our outlook for this year. And this is a moving target, work in progress, if you will, as we look at budgets. The primary crop budgets that we're looking at, corn, soybeans, and wheat for this year for 22. And as David's already mentioned, this is moving. It's a moving target, and we're changing these almost weekly, some of these prices and some of these costs that we're putting into this budget scenario. So seed costs, this is actually a little bit lower than what we were projecting earlier this year. Plugging in about a 5% higher seed cost for producers on these major commodity crops. Crop chemical costs, this is a mixed bag. We're looking at a number of these products that are 100 to 200% higher than they were last year. But some of the costs on some of these chemicals are more of a nominal increase compared to last year. So overall, we're plugging in about 50% higher crop protection chemical costs for our herbicide, fungicide, and insecticide costs. Drying, diesel, hauling, all related to energy. And this has been very volatile, as everyone knows. So some of these prices have moved, and we've plugged in a little bit of a change in some of these costs. Right now, we're plugging in $4 per gallon for diesel costs at the farm gate. And I know that's probably a little bit lower than where we are and where we can purchase diesel right now delivered to the farm. But we are looking at more of a long-term growing season average costs. That number may be much higher. It may be a little bit lower, but that's at least right now what we're thinking might be the average. You can certainly disagree with me on that. Fertilizer prices, some of the ones that we plug into our crop budgets, ammonia, we're looking at around $1,500 a ton, MAP 925, potash 815. You can see the percent increases from where they were this past spring. So let's take a little bit deeper look at fertilizer. And some of this is going to be review. We've gone through some of these things over the last couple of months, talking about some of the key fundamentals, at least as I see them, that are really driving fertilizer prices. And I think we'll continue to drive these throughout this growing season as we work our way through the winter, into the spring, and through our side dress period, when we really kind of turn off the spigot as far as what our needs are for this growing season. There's lots of questions out there as far as what this next fall might bring in terms of fertilizer prices. And we're constantly evaluating that as well. But right now, I want to discuss what we might expect and what are driving these prices for this year. So the first thing is on the demand side, and we've talked about this, high crop prices globally continue to drive demand, and are probably is that one of the key fundamentals as we look at all the different products that we're buying and utilizing at the farm gate. On the supply side, we've talked about a number of these already. The fertilizer sector basically being unprepared for the run up in crop prices, and we're caught mostly flat-footed as those crop prices rallied into the fall of 20 and on in through 21 and now into 22. And together with some of the COVID limitations, the labor-related shortages, the shipping issues that resulted from primarily the pandemic. And then we had some special weather-related issues, Hurricane Ida disrupting the Gulf area, which not only disrupted the shipping in and out of that, but also disrupted some production because we have some key facilities in that part of the US. In the February 21 freeze in Texas, disrupting natural gas production, high natural gas prices and availability issues in Europe have been especially acute. So those things have led to slowdowns in production and higher costs for their fertilizer that they are manufacturing there in Europe. So we go to the next slide and we look at some trade specific issues. China halting phosphate and UAN fertilizer exports. And the last we have heard, probably going to be through the end of June, perhaps even longer. And we don't know yet. That's probably going to change before we get to the end of June. Sanctions on Belarus, and these sanctions occurred before Russia invaded Ukraine. We had, Europe had serious issues with illegal immigrants entering the EU from Belarus. Sanctions were placed on Belarus and by the EU, and then following that by us, by the US. Recently, we had notification that JSC Belaruskali declared force majeure, indicating that it wouldn't be able to meet contracts. So that was another domino that we continue to see those things fall in that part of the world. And of course, the big one that's dominating headlines globally, not just on agriculture, but for human suffering and loss of life, the Russian invasion and the ongoing war against Ukraine. So major disruptions in that part of the world. I'm not going to get into the grain side. I'm sure Sinki is going to talk a little bit about that. But as far as the fertilizer side, I think we've got various things that are at play here. First of all, Russia has indicated that they're going to suspend fertilizer exports. We know that we're going to probably see some supply disruptions, and we already are seeing some of those that are going to continue to push prices higher globally. But on the other hand, Ukraine is such a big user of fertilizer, we still are uncertain as far as how much demand loss there's going to be as a result of the ongoing war in Ukraine and what might happen with their demand side. So there could be, we're certainly going to see both sides of this coin, the supply and demand coin, be affected by this ongoing war. So we go to the next slide then, and this is looking at a couple of things that we've already addressed, at least in the last one and maybe the last 2 months, and some of these anti-dumping cases that have already been in the works for months and months, and have already, I think most of this is already built in to the global fertilizer prices. But especially the first one, the anti-dumping case brought by Mosaic, countervailing duties are already in place on phosphate fertilizers from Russia and Morocco. And they have to have cash deposits as those products come in from those two countries to compensate. And those duties are in place already for those products. We do now know, and the Department of Commerce has issued an affirmative preliminary determination in the anti-dumping case that was brought by CF Industries against companies in 2 countries, in Russia and Trinidad. And that followed Commerce's affirmative preliminary countervailing duty determination that was made this past fall in November for UAN or liquid fertilizer products. So we're already seeing those countervailing duties, and we're likely going to see a final determination that those will be in place for 5 years as those determinations are made by the Department of Commerce. Probably is not going to make a big difference in terms of Russian imports, because we're likely not going to have that option anyway, but it will have some impact coming out of Morocco and Trinidad from those products. And then last but not least, one of the things that has been talked about for months is just whether or not many of these companies are retaining their same margins, and some simply supply and demand factors that are at play in increasing these fertilizer prices, or is there a level of profit taking in the sector? And I think that it's probably safe to say that there is some. It's difficult to really identify how much of these price increases are profit taking, but one of the comments that came out of the Secretary of Agriculture's office was that they're seriously going to be looking at some of these things much closer. At least that's the language that I saw from Vilsack. Okay, let's go on to the next slide then. And this came out of the Fertilizer Institute and some data that I saw recently. If you're curious as far as what amount of fertilizer is exported out of Russia, you can see down there at the bottom, Russia accounts for 23% of the ammonia, 14% of the urea, 21% of the potash, as well as 10% of processed phosphate exports. So substantial exporter. And in situations like this, we typically do see market channels reshuffled, and that's likely what's going to happen for product that might normally be going to Western countries. And that's that's as far as the marketplace, I think that's what the marketplace is guessing will happen at this point if things continue as they are, that we'll see that export flow into the Western countries that are sanctioning Russia being cut off and probably being reshuffled. And we may see not a big spike in prices, although we have seen some upward pressure on prices here in the last couple of weeks. Okay, let's go on then, and just a couple more comments. And we've had questions recently about how to hedge against fertilizer price increases. And we don't have any futures exchanges any longer that allows us to trade or set up any kind of a hedge against fertilizer price increases. However, many of these companies that are important in the US in terms of fertilizer manufacturing and sales, they do trade stock on many of our exchanges. So perhaps purchasing fertilizer stock is an option for some of you. And this is the Mosaic stock in the last year. You can see a pretty significant increase in stock value from Mosaic. And the next one is CF Industries. And I pick on these two primarily because they were the lead names on the anti-dumping cases that we've seen flow through the U.S. International Trade Commission and the Department of Commerce. And you can see CF Industries also substantial increases in their stock price in the last year. Okay, so that finishes that discussion. Overall, we're looking at increases in variable costs, substantial increases. These are just variable costs. These do not include machinery and equipment or rent. So if you're going to have an increase in some of those costs, you're going to see your fuller cost portfolio increase more than what we're even showing here, perhaps. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. And this is, I tweaked and edited this today. And I know we may not end up with $6.25 corn as an average for this growing season. However, if we were to look at the December futures right now and take some basis, negative basis of about 20 cents, we can lock in about $6.25 for this fall delivery. And at that one column that we're seeing 183 bushel corn, it's substantial gross revenue and can cover up a lot of the price and cost increases that we're seeing already built into our cost and cost side. We go down to the returns above variable costs around $500 an acre. We still have to cover a lot of overhead out of that, just as a reminder. So that number, even with all these higher costs, still with $6.25 corn, it doesn't look too bad. Let's go on to soybeans then. Plugging in about $14.50 per bushel for soybeans, and we look at November futures, with a little basis eliminated or taken off, and we can get about 14.50. 57 bushel beans, we look down there, return to variable costs around $508. So again, those corn and soybeans right now, at least as we see it, or at least as I see it with the cost structure that we put together in the budgets, those two are pretty close in terms of returns to variable costs. And then wheat, we'll go to the next one. Probably the most volatile commodity crop budget that I've ever seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Since the invasion, we've seen giant moves in this, and it took a big step down today. And I'm not going to stay anymore. Sinki can talk more about that, but $9.70 a bushel for summer delivery of spring winter wheat here in Ohio. And it stands up pretty well. Returns above variable costs around $429. Doesn't include any double crop or straw return. So probably a good argument to save whatever wheat you already have planted out there throughout Ohio. So let's go to the next one. This is just a comparison of all three of them as we kind of look at the returns to variable costs, and the numbers, as we've already stated, looking pretty similar across the three primary commodity crops in Ohio. And then the last slide I think I have, well, no, I have two more. One is just a notice that went out yesterday, and this came out from the IRS. The farmers filing late, there's going to be a waiver of penalties. And so in effect, farmers that didn't pay estimated taxes by the middle of January and were on course to have to file by March 1st. Maybe they were late, but they're going to be granted relief under this IRS notice that came out. It was originally going to be relief for those people that were shareholders of an S corporation with some of the forms that they had to deal with being late to come out and be published. So now all farmers, even if you filed after the March 1 deadline and you didn't file or pay estimated taxes, you're safe without penalty until April 18th this year, not April 15th. Okay, so then the last slide is just a reminder. If you have custom rate business, if you perform custom rates for your neighboring farmers, or if you are a farm owner that you're hiring your neighbor to conduct and do some custom work, we would certainly welcome all of the data that we can get. So please, you can link to that survey, and even if it's just a few, even if you just do some harvesting for your neighbor, just fill out that portion of the survey, skip to the end, and you're done. So we'd welcome all the data that we can get. And with that, David, I think I'm ready to turn it over to Sinki. So Sinki, it's all yours. And thanks again, everyone. I think you're muted, Sinki. So.
Hi. Can you see my screen? Okay. Great.
Yep.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sinki Lee. I'm an assistant professor in AEDE department, and I'm going to talk about the grain marketing outlook today. So let's get started. So the first look of the current market is the price increase. The right graph shows the US inflation rate since 1990. And as shown, we are seeing the highest inflation rate within the 3 decades. Specifically, BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, announced this month that the US inflation during the February was 7.9%. Unfortunately, many analysts expect we will see a high inflation rate for March as well. There are several factors explaining the current market move. Without surprise, the existing inflation pressure and supply chain issues after COVID are still affecting. Also, Russian invasion of Ukraine and South America production shortfalls are additionally raising many prices related to agriculture. Although commodity price rally itself can be a bullish signal, as many input and raw materials became expensive, as Barry shared in the previous presentation. At the same time, bearish perspectives are mixed to some extent based on the current market. Let me talk a little bit more about the grain market response to the invasion of Ukraine. The graph shows the future price index for several major crops. All prices are normalized by January 3rd price level. So daily futures prices are divided by the January 3rd price of each crop. And the gray area in the picture is showing the movement of futures prices after the outbreak of Russian invasion of Ukraine. US wheat, Black Sea wheat, and corn all showed significant increases as a response to the war in Ukraine. Specifically in early March, US wheat reached about 70% higher than its start price of the year. Now, still, it is more than 40% higher than the January price. The corn futures price is also 25% higher than its January price. Soybean futures price went sideways during this period, implying less direct impact of the war in Ukraine on the soybean markets. So from this figure, we can see the extent how much each commodity was affected by the war in the breadbasket of Europe. Okay, now let's take a look at what USDA updated for the corn in their March WASDE report. I highlighted specific changes from the February report by yellow colors. First, when looking at the bottom row of the table, the season average price has been increased from $5.45 per bushel to $5.65 per bushel, so 20 cents up. Of course, in this case, the season means from 2021 through 2022, so we are still in the 21-22 season. Yeah, and this can be explained by demand shifts. The ethanol corn demand was adjusted up by 25 million bushels. The exports forecast was ramped up by 75 million bushels as well. These are reflections of the potential shock in the supply chain across the board due to the war in Ukraine. Lastly, for the 22-23 season production, USDA projected a small drop in corn area, expecting 92 million acres in total, but an increase in production volume based on the yield improvement. However, the 22-23 forecast does not factor in the Russian-Ukraine war, so we should take it with a grain of salt. This is a summary of world corn production. Last month, USDA reduced Brazil's corn production due to drought issues there. And this month, it was Argentina's turn. Despite those reductions, world corn production continues to hit record levels. Specifically, the March update was actually mainly driven by India, shown at the bottom of this table. And additionally, explaining a little bit about the Brazilian forecast. In fact, second crop corn, which takes 70% of Brazilian corn, will be harvested as of May. So Brazil still has some good production potential, and that is why we still see some bright prospects of the global corn supply. I would like to highlight Ukraine as well. Of course, Ukraine's 21-22 marketing year harvest was already done last year, so production itself did not change, but we should be mindful that there is a huge uncertainty whether the harvested stock can be effectively distributed. And Speaking of Ukraine's crop production a bit more, Ukraine has been increasing its corn production for several years. Now, Ukraine is the fourth largest corn exporter following US, Brazil, and Argentina. As shown in the right figure, Ukraine farmers had a successful harvest last year. This implies, obviously, the export loss from Ukraine due to the war influenced the market in a very unique way. The export shifts and price response we see now are not because of a typical shortage of supply or excess demand, but mostly because of frictions in logistics. That is why it is hard to simply say the US export is showing pure bullish prospects. It can easily disappear or even go opposite direction at some point because still there exists some stocks. So once the logistic issues is resolved, then maybe market can quickly move in the opposite direction. So we should keep that in mind. Let's talk a little bit about the soybeans. For soybean, USDA only changed exports and price. As shown at the bottom of the right table, the season average price was updated from $13 per bushel to $13.25 per bushel. Export increase was the main reason, and this is the consequence of the production problem in South America. Additionally, USDA projected the soybean acreage for 22-23 season as 88 million acres, which is a slight increase from the 21-22 season. Again, this number does not reflect the war in Ukraine. I expect their prospective planting report, which will be released at the end of this March, maybe at that time we will see more precise estimates from the USDA. And here is the table showing the production estimates of major soybean producing countries. I highlighted Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. In fact, most of the foreign production change was attributable to the decrease in these three countries. Paraguay is especially estimated to produce 46.5% less soybean than last year. And quantity-wise, Brazil shows an outstanding drop. It is estimated to decrease by 11 million metric tons, which is 8% drop from the last year. As people anticipate, about 90% of the export loss of Brazil can be potential demand for US crops. So this might be generating some opportunities for US farmers. Now let's briefly check the world weather. For the US, drought issues, which started last December, remain a large concern, especially to the Western states and some parts of Western Corn Belt states as well. The dry conditions make it easier to plant, but crops eventually will need moisture, so this is still concerning. Globally, during February, many regions also suffered from drought, which escalated concerns of supply shortage. Fortunately, the concern became a bit lowered during March. This is kind of some updated. So this world map shows the summary of global weather released yesterday. During the last 2 weeks, many major crop producing regions had favorable weather. Specifically, after severe drought during February, South American countries are having good amount of rain, which will help their production progress. This may be reflected as an adjustment in the global production estimates later on. And this is my last slide. We are facing a highly volatile market now. Some parts are covered by classic economics with supply and demand, but the other factor, the war, is really making anything can happen. The market swing will likely continue even if the war ends shortly, which is unfortunately the best case scenario. So I want to emphasize a few traditional pearls of wisdoms against a volatile market. First off, of course, you should stay on top of up-to-date market information. And strategy-wise, I'd recommend prioritizing taking care of downside risks. Specifically, when calculating the expected returns, maybe putting extra weights on the worst cases and checking the risk-adjusted expected profits can be one example. And lastly, I want to remind a couple of items to be stressed for 22-23 season. First, as input costs are getting harder to manage, looking around feasible cost-saving strategies would be potentially valuable a lot, which was well addressed in Barry's presentation today. The second item is crop insurance. Although price rally gets crop insurance less paid attention, still it can effectively protect farmers' net profit if the market moves against their position. Third, a fair question to ask would be the potential impact of war on the Ukraine production for 22-23 season. In fact, we are approaching the deadline by nature. As we can see in the right picture, the major crops, including corn, are supposed to be planted as of April in Ukraine. If the war doesn't end until March or maybe early April, the substantial drop in Ukraine grain production will be inevitable, which will affect the next marketing year. So from a far-sighted perspective, what's happening in Ukraine will continuously be important, I would say. Okay, I think that's all for today of my presentation.
Hey, Sinki, I have a question for you on the wheat harvest that's going on or will go on in the Ukraine. Hearing reports that a lot of it's being damaged by the war. Has the market adequately adjusted for the potential that wheat that's should be harvested this summer over there is not going to be what they thought originally? Or has the market already accounted for that?
I think still, like, of course, partly yes, because already like futures price reflected this shock and increased the price, which is reflecting some supply chain issues and assuming some portion of Ukraine wheat cannot be supplied to the proper place, then of course the excess demand happened due to that. So in that sense, it is true, but still like market is pretty like carefully adjusting that because like still anyway wheat is existing like and there is a stock which is available if the war doesn't affect anymore. So that's why I think market is carefully adjusting the price level, but it really like it's really uncertain at this moment. Like as you know, if the war suddenly ends and all people can go back to the like distribution channel, then maybe we will see like the market quickly move back to the normal. But otherwise, it can be even worse. So that's why I think, in some sense, market adjusted already. But if war like gets even worse and then like that affects all the machineries and in the Ukraine infrastructures, then maybe I would say market didn't actually reflect that factor yet because that didn't happen.
Good, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, we're going to turn it to Robert Moore to talk about long-term care cost. Thank you, Sinki. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Robert, you are muted. There we go.
Thanks for the reminder. I forget that sometimes. Okay. So I'm going to talk about some long-term care cost issues. This is an issue that I think a lot of farmers have concerns about, legitimately worry about it. So I thought today I'd start off by talking about generally what it is. In future presentations, we may go into a bit more detail on strategies, but for today, I thought just an introduction on the topic might be a good start. So first of all, wanted to go over what the costs are. And as you can see, the good news is Ohio is a little under the national average. The bad news is it's still very expensive. So a nursing home cost for, per year is going to be somewhere $80,000 to $100,000 a year. Depends on where you go. Some places are less expensive. You can go to nicer places in the bigger cities like Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati tend to be a little more expensive too. But that gives you some idea of what kind of cost we might be looking at. And even assisted living is not cheap. So assisted living is 50, 60,000 in that range. The average stay, this varies a lot. I've seen it everywhere from a little over 1 year to up to 4 years. So I kind of use something in the middle. 2.2 years is a number I see. But one thing to keep in mind too is women's stays in nursing home will tend to be longer than men's stay just because of life expectancy. And I know every time I've gone into a nursing home, there's always seems to be a lot more women than men there. So as we think about nursing home planning, we do need the gender of the persons we're dealing with does matter. And here's a past, present, and future averages. And from 20 to 2030, the cost is expected to go up about 30%. So costs are definitely not going down. Nursing home costs, like all medical related costs, have been trending up. I don't think that's going to discontinue. I think it's only going to continue. And so not only is it an issue today, but it very well may be even a bigger issue in the future. So the next slide says 7 out of 10 people will require long-term care. And Genworth, I had this in one of the previous slides, they do a survey. Genworth is a life insurance, long-term care insurance financial company, and they do a pretty extensive survey. So they seem to have some of the best information available on nursing home statistics. Their statistic is 7 out of 10 people will require long-term care. Now, one thing to keep in mind is, some of those 7 people will only be there a few months, a few weeks for rehab, post-surgery, post-injury, things like that. Not everybody goes to a long-term care facility because they're unable to take care of themselves. So that number probably is skewed a little bit high. I wouldn't expect 7 out of 10 people to stay in a nursing home for 2 to 4 years. The next bullet point there, long-term care costs the biggest financial threat to farming operations. And I mean this in the context of transferring from one generation to the next. 10 years ago, we would have said estate taxes are the biggest threat to a viable farming operation being passed to the next generation. Today, I would say it's long-term care cost. They're just so significant, and as we'll talk about here in a little bit, there is no easy way to address them. So the issue becomes, is there an extra $90,000 of income to pay nursing home costs? If there's not, is there savings to pay for nursing home cost? If there's not any or adequate savings, then we start looking at what assets will be sold to pay for nursing home cost. And if assets are sold for nursing home cost, can the farm continue without those sold assets? So unless we've got a plan in place, that's kind of the step-by-step process we go through when we've got someone in a nursing home and we don't have adequate income to pay for that $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 a month bill. So we'll talk about Medicaid next. And the reason why Medicaid is important is because for people who are unable to pay for their long-term care cost, Medicaid will pay those costs. And Medicaid is it's partly state, partly federal program, and it's used mostly by people that don't have the financial resources for their medical needs. And I should have put this on the slide, but I want to make sure we understand the difference between Medicaid and Medicare. So Medicare is for older people. Medicare will pay for 20 days of long-term care and 100 days with copay. So Medicare does have a very short-term payment for long-term care, but it is definitely not a long-term solution. So Medicaid can pay for nursing home cost if assets are not available, and it's administered by the states according to federal requirements. So it's a joint program of both state and federal. So who is eligible for Medicaid? And as I've worked with clients over the years, this is a big issue because most people know Medicaid will pay for nursing homes. A lot of people don't understand what are the eligibility requirements. And those eligibility requirements are challenging to meet for most farmers. So let's take a look at some of these numbers. Your income cannot exceed $2,500 a month. Although this is pretty easy to get around. If somebody's making $3,000 a month, there's a special kind of trust you can set up and put the extra $500 in it, then it goes to the nursing home. So the income limit isn't the issue. The issue is the asset limit. So for a single person, you can own almost nothing, $2,000. You own more than $2,000 of assets, those assets must be spent down to qualify for Medicaid. For married people, essentially $139,000 that you can own. Now there are exempt assets. So without getting into a lot of details and being here all night, residences are exempt for at least some period of time, meaning residences don't have to be spent down to pay for long-term care costs. But exempt doesn't mean they're exempt from the risk of long-term care because there is still a state recovery. So even though the house may not have to be sold while the person is in the nursing home, when that person passes away, Medicaid can take that house, sell it, and get paid for whatever is owed to them. So exempt assets are only temporarily exempt. So the issue becomes for farmers, very few qualify. $139,000, that's 10 or 20 acres anymore. So farmers are not going to qualify for Medicaid without some aggressive planning. So what can farmers do, or anybody for that matter, do if their assets exceed that $149,000 or $2,000, depending on the marital status? So again, a lot of clients have come in over the years and said, I want to protect my assets from nursing home cost. And then my next comment is usually, are you okay with giving up all ownership and all control of the assets that you want to protect? And usually that's the land. And a lot of times the conversation turns very quickly to, I didn't know that was the case. I'm not sure I want to do that. But that's what it requires. You have to get assets out of your name if you don't want them subject to nursing home cost. Now, how is that done? Assets can be gifted to family members or anyone for that matter, or an irrevocable trust can be used. The advantage of an irrevocable trust is in some situations you can still keep income from those assets. And also you can control how those assets eventually go to the next generation by putting age limits on it or restriction on sales or things like that. But you have to give those assets away to somebody or an irrevocable trust. Now, the 5-year look back is what makes Medicaid planning particularly challenging. And that's because if you give away all of your land, you're going to be ineligible for Medicaid for 5 years. So an example I use, it's about $7,000 per month of gifts for each month of ineligibility. So if you gift $100,000, you're ineligible for 14 months. If you gift $1 million, you're not ineligible for 140 months. It's capped at 60 months or 5 years. But the reason this is done is without this rule, everybody that was going into the nursing home tomorrow would give all their assets away today and qualify for Medicaid, and the program would go bankrupt, overnight. So that rule is there to help keep the program solvent and prevent that scenario from happening. So again, what are the challenges of qualifying for Medicaid? Giving up ownership and control, that's the big one. You may not have control over what facility, because not all facilities take Medicaid. Probably will not be in a private room if that's important to you. And there's a moral dilemma. Some people struggle with giving all your assets away to qualify for a government program. Other people have a different idea of, I've paid taxes all my life, I've paid into Medicaid, it's time for me to get back from Medicaid. Both are legitimate attitudes to have in that respect, but some people struggle with that issue. So what are strategies for long-term care costs? So sometime in the future, we'll go into a lot more detail on these. But just quickly, one strategy is do nothing. This is what most people do. Most people don't have the resources to set up an irrevocable trust, or don't know how to do it or what to do. So that's what most people do. And some people just kind of play the odds and hope they don't go into the nursing home. Gift assets to the family. So, usually we're dealing with land in these situations. So gift all the land to the family, and then after 5 years, you get past the 5-year look back period, those assets are safe from nursing home cost. Same strategy with irrevocable trust, put assets in an irrevocable trust, and then wait that 5 years. Long-term care insurance, that's my preferred way to deal with long-term care costs, but the challenge is that it can be expensive. It can be outside of a lot of people's budgets. And also many people aren't insurable. If you have many pre-existing conditions, there's a good chance you are not insurable for long-term care insurance. And then self-insure, save up money. But you never know how much you need, how long you're going to be in the nursing home. That's also money that could be going in to grow the farm. The main takeaway from this slide is there are no easy solutions for long-term care cost. Every strategy has significant disadvantages to it. But the main thing is to at least understand the pros and cons and try to find the plan that works at least the best for you. Implement that plan to try to, as best we can, plan for a viable farming operation to pass to the next generation. So that's all I've got.
Okay, thanks, Robert. So I will take the next few minutes to talk about some of our farm business analysis numbers. And we've had an introduction to all of those for our 2020 analysis. We're currently doing the 2021 analysis, and I'll talk to you for a few minutes about that at the very end. But just a reminder, last year we started looking at numbers for crop farms. And so we're looking at farms that particularly focus on the production and sales of corn, soybean, and wheat crops. And you can see, well, let's see how tweaky I can get on these slides. My apologies. So you can see the shaded counties that are on our Ohio map are the counties where these farms are located. And so the numbers I'm going to share with you today are from these 24 farms that are either completely raising crops and marketing those in quantity. There are also a couple dairy farms in this group that have grain production, significant grain production as another enterprise. So they're a more diversified farm, but are selling semi-loads of crops. So earlier this year, or I guess it was in November, so late last year, we looked at these first financial standards for these groups and also did a little comparison of what that looked like to the 30 farms that met these criteria in 2019. Size-wise, we're looking at an average size of 1,000 acres, and there's a range from about 100 acres up to about 2,500 acres on these farms. Their current ratio, so we looked at the cash position of these farms, current ratio, working capital, comparing working capital to gross income. So is that working capital enough for the size of the business? And also the solvency of those farm businesses. So just a quick look there, you can see what those numbers were. And today we're going to dig a little more into the financial efficiency numbers for these farms. So the first one is the asset turnover rate. And we'll look first at the average of all the farms and the benchmarks. And then we're going to dig a little deeper into those and compare what those are based on farm size. So our benchmark for asset turnover rate, where we're comparing the revenue generated by the business to the value of all the assets that business is using to produce that revenue, we'd like to see that greater than 45%. All farms average 25.4%. So we aren't quite getting where we want to be, but I'm pretty sure, looking at what the grain prices are doing now, that when we come and visit this again next year, when we have much higher grain prices, we're going to see that much closer to 45%. So that is influenced heavily by what kind of a crop year it was and what those crop prices are. So not meeting it there, that's going to continue to be a challenge for farms who own a lot of crop ground, particularly if they purchased that crop ground in the last couple of years, as we've seen that cost per acre increase. Then operating expense ratio. So I really get my jollies out of these last four because they kind of take a look at, of our gross revenues, where are they going? And so as we look at these, the biggest chunk is operating expenses. And we'd like to see that less than 60%. Our 2020 farm performance was at 66.3% for all farms. So that's chunk number one. Chunk number two is depreciation. So this is not our income tax depreciation, but a cost valuation on the balance sheet. So what we purchased a piece of equipment for, less an economic depreciation each year. And just a reminder for how we handle this in our business analysis program. Machinery and equipment is depreciated at 7%, titled vehicles at 15%, buildings and improvements at 5%. And everybody's is charged the same way. So depreciation expense, we'd like to see it at less than 5%. We were at 7.5%. Interest expense is next, averaged 4.1%. We'd like to see that at less than 5%. And then finally, you know, once we take these first three out, basically it's what's left to keep. And so that last piece of the pie that we'll be looking at this in a pie format is 22% was able to be kept. We'd like to see that at 20%. So let's take a look at these in a little more depth by farm size. The first one, that asset turnover ratio, our average was 25.4%. It's up a little for the farms that participated. From the previous year was about 1% lower. And so really kind of the way to think of it is we have this big chunk of assets, and our value of farm production, we'd like to see at least 45%. So just under half. We'd like to generate dollars equivalent to just under half at a minimum of the value of those assets. So like to see that greater than 45%. Our average was 25. And if we would compare the yields and prices from last year, the prices at least, you know, we're going to see definitely higher prices for our crops in 2021. So we should see this asset turnover ratio increasing. But as we look across by farm size, there wasn't a lot of variation in asset turnover rate among those farms. And we'll be presenting those by, we had 5 farms between 100 and 500 acres, 8 between 500 and 1,000, another 5 between 1,000 and 15, and 6 farms that had more than 1,500 acres. So we're going to use these pie charts to look at the last 4 of those financial efficiency measures. In this first cut, or this first chomp, to me, these look like Pac-Man. If you have gray hair, you know who Pac-Man was. So I kind of like to think of that as that net farm income. How big a bite is that taking out of the gross returns? I'm sorry, the operating expenses, how big a bite is that taking? And it's going to be the biggest chunk. And our average was 66%. And here we're down significantly from the previous year. That year was about 10% higher on average for these farms. So Pac-Man has a bigger open jaw here for most of these. So we have 62% there for our smaller farms. Not much different in these first 2 groups, 62, 63, 61%. But we did see a little bit higher here for our greater than 1,500 acre farms. Oh, sorry. So chunk bite number 2 is our depreciation expense ratio. And that averaged 7.5 for all of our farms. And you can kind of see where the numbers were by farm size, 9%. Rounded up, you'll see our pie chart tends to round these just about 9% here for our smallest farm size, 6.4%, or rounded it up to 7% for the 500 to 1,000 acres, 1,001 to 1,500 at 8%, and 9% here. So a relatively tight range on depreciation expense for different sized farms. The next piece of our gross revenues, then we're looking at interest. So when we originally looked at operating expenses, typically we think of interest as part of those operating expenses. They are part of our income statement. But when we look at these financial standards measures that we've talked about for the last few months, typically on the operating expenses, interest is going to be deducted. And the reason for that is when we're benchmarking, we want to take out some of the factors that can unduly influence within whatever we're comparing. And interest is one of those. It's going to be heavily influenced by farms that have more borrowings, are more highly leveraged, are typically going to have higher chunks of their expenses are going to be made up of interest. So if we take interest out of, for instance, the operating expense ratio, we've taken the impact of how highly leveraged these farms are out of play. So that's why our blue operating expense piece of the pie does not include interest, and that is added back as a separate benchmark here in the financial efficiency measures. Our average was 4.1%, down a little bit from 4.8 the previous year. In this particular factor, that benchmark being of less than 5%, all of our groups are at or below 5%, our farm sizes. Our 500 to 1,000 acres had the lowest percent of their gross returns being eaten up by interest payments, whereas our two largest size farm groups were right there at that 5%. So this purple piece of the pie is the one we really want to see be bigger, and that is the net farm income. So what we get to keep, what the farm gets to keep and allocate then to, there are some jobs that net farm income has to do. It's going to cover family living. It would need to cover any principal payments, reinvestments of the business, and so forth. So the good news is that our benchmark is greater than 20%, and all but our largest farm size was greater than 20. And this is much higher than it was in 2019. So some good progress there. For the smallest group in 2019, this net farm income piece was 17%, as opposed to the 26% in 2020. For our 500 to 1,000 acre farms, they increased from 16% to 28, 15% to 26% here for our 1,000 to 1,500 acre farm. And even though this is not meeting the benchmark, it is much better than it was in 2019. It was at 5% that year. So even though we understand that the gross revenues are going to be higher for that larger herd size, sorry, the dairy person in me coming out, those larger acreage farms, the total dollars will be more. They're likely to still have larger principal payment commitments and more people to be paying family living to, et cetera. So some good trends there. And I would expect as we look at, it's going to be interesting to see in 2021's analysis, and then really in 2022, I expect 2021's to look good. We're working on that right now. But in 2022, what the impact of the higher prices is, we'll have more gross revenues generated, but how are they going to be offset by the operating expenses that we've spent a great deal of time, both Barry and Sin-Key, talking about those expenses. So while it's not the first thing I think farms should concentrate on when they start looking at financial analysis and some of their financial standards, I think the liquidity, the solvency, the profitability are important. These financial efficiency then is another group of figures that a farm should start looking at once they start really digging into their financials, because we certainly want to be generating and keeping as much of that income that's generated as possible. I did mention that we're in the middle of analysis now. This is our team around Ohio. And what I really want to point out here today is that I do have a position open, and it just opened this week for a farm business analysis technician. Another one up in this Northwest Ohio area. You can see that requisition. You can go to jobs.osu.edu and search for that. And Jeff is also going to drop a link into the box to look at that. So if you want to look at that, it's a part-time as needed. We do our work pretty much between January and June. So we'll get this new person trained and hopefully get them completing a couple farms, and that might be something they want to continue. So in our virtual world, our technicians have typically worked virtually. So the home office is Defiance, but mostly these people will be working. We work from our homes. So they don't have to be located in Defiance, but we'll be working with farms primarily in that Northwest, North Central Ohio area. So it's nice if they're in that area. The application or the requisition does mention that we start at $16 an hour, but we have a range of 16 to 20 depending on experience. So that'll be open for 2 weeks. And if you know of anyone who might be interested in that, please encourage them to apply. And if they have questions, please give me a call. And you can find more data on the farm business analysis. You can download the PDFs of our summaries. There's a crop summary, a dairy summary that you can find at farmprofitability.osu.edu directly, or you can also find them through Farm Office. So I am going to transition that back to, I believe David is next.
Yes, I am. Excellent, Diane. And you get to work with Diane if you get hired. So you can jump aboard and get trained by the best. Well, last month, Jeff did a great job, and we got some really, really good reviews about sharing more about the Farm Office website. And part of that that we would like to do is continue to spotlight some of our partner agencies, as well as some of the programs that folks can take advantage of. And tonight's spotlight is going to take a look at the Farm Service Agency. And as we go forward on Farm Office Lives, of course, there will be some targeted programs that the Farm Service Agency is offering that we'll mention. For instance, on past couple, we have mentioned the farm storage loan program that you can borrow money for farm storage needs. But looking at the Farm Service Agency across Ohio, of course, it's across the United States, providing financial security net to Americans farmers. And the information and the place that we're going to go, you can see the website, www.fsa.usda.gov. And that's where we're going to kind of take a peek at, so you can get familiar with that website. But before we do that, I'd like to just show you and remind you, of course, the county offices across the state of Ohio. Not every county has their individual office. So as you look at this map, one thing you'll notice, it's color coded. So if we look to the far northeast, you'll see Ashtabula Lake and Geauga counties. Those are administrated out of one office out of Orwell, Ohio, down in the southwest portion of Ashtabula County. If you come down to where I'm at in Coshocton County, you can see we have our individual office here in Coshocton County with Mike Jacob as the FSA director. And also he's at this time is covering that vacant position in Holmes County too. And if you move over to Central Ohio there at Franklin County, Cheryl King is the leader of the two counties there, and that is all administered between Franklin and Pickaway County program out of the Pickaway office. And then the Farm Service Agency farm loan contacts are again not in every county, and in fact they are regional, and you can kind of see how the state when we talk about some of the farm loan programs in the future, you might look to see, well, where do I go if I want to talk about one of these farm loans? And you can see different color coded. For instance, where I'm at in Coshocton County, our loan officer would be down in Zanesville office. So I want to take a quick look at the website. So here I'm going to pause for just a second to flip my screen so you can see the website live. And you should be able to make sure, if only if I could see that website would be a good thing. Okay, so and Diane, you can probably see, can just want to
Yeah,
give me a
you're
heads
good.
up. Okay, I just want to make sure with technology, you never know. When you go to the fsa.usda.gov, the homepage website, this is what you're going to see. And as we scroll down, you can see the different, of course, across the top is where you're going to probably negotiate with your mouse. But you can see down at the bottom, talk about the 2018 Farm Bill. Won't be long before we talk about the next one. That's where you can find the information there. If you're looking for national program deadlines, we talk about those deadlines here on Farm Office Live, but you can click on that button and it will take you to see which are those deadlines that are coming up. And for instance, we talked about these two, the dairy margin coverage and the spot market hog pandemic program, of those deadlines coming. And if you see those deadlines and want to learn more information, of course, you can click and then get more information. Farmers.gov, the farmers.gov is where all the pandemic hotline, I guess, this is where we go to just to check to see what's rolling out from the USDA, especially as we were in the middle of the pandemic. It seemed like this website was being updated all the time, but that's the portal where you can go in to see if there's additional assistance. And again, we watch that. And then there's a disaster resource center as well. And then down here, we've mentioned the American Rescue Plan debt payments as far as that. And we know it's, as Peggy and Robert have both talked about here, that is in litigation. So where they were going to pay off 120% of the loans for the socially disadvantaged producers as part of this American Rescue Plan. And that is again in court. But then there's the crop acreage reporting for when producers need to report their crops. And then there's also a couple sections in there where you can ask the USDA questions right there. And one thing here for the programs and services, I think just to show is that we have a great appreciation, I guess, an extension for our partners at FSA, just because the amount of programs that they have to lift up and those amount of programs that they've had to lift up increased when we went into the pandemic. But you can see the ARC PLC program. You could click on that if you needed to learn more. Of course, that deadline was yesterday. But if you're looking at Farm Bill, there's the Farm Bill home. You can go to the farm loans, the dairy margin coverage program that Diane's talked about multitude times. It's on here. We also mentioned about the organic certification cost share program on this program. Again, that's where the information's there. People are looking for state offices. Of course, we know where ours is. And then the online services. And then there's a newsroom button where you can see any release that the FSA is pushing out. But the online services, again, you can go and check out a couple of their services there. The newsroom is there. And if you click under the newsroom, if you're looking for fact sheets, the FSA does a great job about putting fact sheets out in every subject. So whether it's bees and pollinators, whether it's the traditional commodity program, the income safety net program, when it comes to ARC, to PLC, to our different programs there, you can see the market facilitation program that was rolled out. It's there. The farm storage facility loans that I mentioned, it's all there. And then all the conservation programs for the conservation reserve program, you can see all of those are listed there. So we don't have a lot of cotton we deal with here, but the dairy programs are down there. And then some disaster protection and recovery programs as well. Energy, environmental activities, fish, and then some general, and then your livestock. So you can see, you could be on here forever going through the different, if you're interested in the loans, of course, the loans are all there. We've talked about some of the micro loans, some of the loans for beginning farmers, socially disadvantaged farmers, the information is there. New farmers, if they're just getting into the farm program, how do they do that? All that information. As far as a one-stop shop when it comes to the programs that the Farm Service Agency offers, it can all be easily found here. So kind of your portal, kind of a look into, you can see it, continue to scroll, just the amount of information that is there. And also, I think everybody on the webinar here today, I hope you've gone and subscribed. You can get a local newsletter from your local Farm Service Agency office in your region. Also, the state newsletter that comes out is just incredible. So we would hope that you could subscribe there as well. And then I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint because I just want to share a few additional things as far as I mean, you've seen this screenshot, but again, there's the website. But program eligibility, of course, there's program eligibility. And a lot of times our new producers will come in and they may be borderline hobby farms. And if the bottom line is, if you're going to be in the federal farm program, they have to be commercially produced commodities. And of course, there's basic paperwork that all producers will have to fill out, have a farm plan. There's the adjusted gross income form that we all fill out each year. And then of course, we are, as producers, are worried about our conservation practices, about that we're sensitive wetlands, so the conservation compliance form is there. Also, just as one thing we did at the Small Farmer Region Conference in Mansfield here on Saturday, this past Saturday, we talked about what are the different definitions. And I'm going to end with the definitions just so everyone's aware of those. Beginner farmer is someone who has not operated a farm for more than 10 years and that they substantially participate. I think an IRS person, Barry, wrote that, materially and substantially participates in the operation. And then you look at a beginner farmer versus a limited resource farmer. There are some limited resource farmer definitions. The two basic ones that you'll see there is not earning more than $177,300 in each of the 2 calendar years. But also that second one, because it's not or, it's and, has a household income at or below the national poverty level for a family of 4 or less than 50% of the county median household income for the previous 2 years for the county that they live in. So as we look at the different programs, based on the definition and how you are classified, may mean that you get a lower interest rate, especially like in the loan programs. You might get a little different interest rates, or there may be some different parameters that you don't have to do, or you have to do depending on how you're defined. Socially disadvantaged farmers or ranchers is anyone who makes up the one of the groups that you see there on the screen. And again, as you go through the different FSA programs, in some respects, any of these would be classified socially disadvantaged. And then there are other times where you see American Indians, Asian, Blacks, African Americans, Native Hawaiians, Hispanics, and women. Women are on the socially disadvantaged list, but know that some of the programs, women are not classified as a socially disadvantaged farmer. So you have to check into the details on each of those. And for our veteran farmers, a classification of veteran is anyone who's operated a farm or ranch for less than 10 years. So this is our beginner veteran farmer, and has obtained their status as a veteran during the most recent 10-year period. So we would say why we appreciate the service of all our men and women who have served our country. So under this definition, someone who was part of a Korean War veteran, a Vietnam veteran, they want to be under the definition of a veteran because it's who has obtained their status during the most recent 10-year period. So some definitions there for you as we get into sharing just some information about our partners. And we really appreciate Farm Service Agency and the things that they do. And I think Jeff has put some of that information is in the chat. And I saw Diane's quote. I don't know how to answer that, Diane. I'm going to have to watch that. And I don't know if I need to read that. That's socially awkward. Yes. I'm going to put in into the chat. There is the evaluation for tonight's program is in the chat to you. We appreciate each of you joining. I'll kind of give a second here to see if are there any Q&As that we need to clean up, team? They see?
I did. I had a question earlier that I misread. It was asking about the filing deadline for S corps, and I had mentioned in my remarks earlier about the filing deadline for shareholders of farmer S corps now being extended till the April 18th filing deadline. For S corps themselves, that filing deadline is still or was March 15th.
Okay, so just a clarification that it's March 15th, Barry, not
the S corp
April 18th.
deadline was still March 15th. Yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, this is the view out my front porch as I walked out to the porch yesterday, and there's some of our crocuses coming up, and which it can only tell us that spring is on the way. So we'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. If you want to catch us again Friday morning at 10 a.m., we'll be replaying this live. We'll be replaying it. If not, we ask you to join us back on April 20th for our next version of this Farm Office Live. So thanks for being with us.